Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be a part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Uri McMillan. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce the Walter Jackson Bate Fellow, Uri McMillan. Professor McMillan is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies, of English, and of Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Identifying as a performance historian, he bends the boundaries between disciplines of art history and visual culture, feminist theory, performance studies, and Black diaspora studies. His research focuses on African diasporic artistic production with a particular concentration on aesthetic and performance cultures. Professor McMillan is the author of Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Arts and Performance. The book won several awards, including the William Sanders Scarborough Prize from the Modern Language Association and the Bernard Hewitt Award for Outstanding Research in Theatre History, and Errol Hill Award from the American Society for Theatre Research. In Embodied Avatars, Professor McMillan co-joins performance studies, art history, and deep archival research to illustrate how Black women have altered their bodies into objects of art, an expression of political ideology and subjectivity. At Radcliffe, Professor McMillan is completing Airbrush, Instamatics, and Funk, art, pop, and New York City's long 1970s. This book-length project studies the artistic practices and networks of affiliation observed by three artists: Jamaican-American visual artist Grace Jones, New Rican illustrator Antonio Lopez, and Black conceptual artist Adrian Piper, living and working in 1970s New York City. Professor McMillan argues that these three artists traveled across fields of culture production in twin efforts to artistically explore new aesthetics forms and to dissolve the edges between seemingly incongruent mediums and disciplines. Through an original synthesis of performance studies, art history and visual culture studies, feminist theory, and Black diaspora studies, Professor McMillan sheds an important light on populations and a time period often viewed as frivolous, if not marginal. Professor McMillan's essay and interviews have been featured in Aperture, ASAP Journal, the Routledge Companion to African American Art History, and Women in Performance, a journal of feminist theory. Additionally, his work has appeared in museum-based publications for the Brooklyn Museum, MCA Chicago, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. He earned his PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Uri McMillan.
All right, thank you all for coming today. I'm going to get right into my talk. I'm sure that people have questions about the continuity between the first book and the second book, which I can gladly answer in a Q&A, as well as, my motivations for this project. But I want to spend the bulk of the time on the person I'm talking about today. So I'm reading from my first chapter, which will be the first chapter of the book. I'm going to read the intro to introduce who this figure is, and then I'm going to get into the middle of the chapter. I usually write my chapters as a triptych, so the middle panel is what I'll be reading from today, but I can gladly talk about what the other two panels look like. Okay, so I'm going to begin with an epigraph. I always want to know what's new. That's why I love the street. I get so many ideas just walking around New York or Paris. In 1983, fashion illustrator Antonio Lopez showcased his unique visual language to students at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. In this lecture demonstration, Lopez invited audiences to witness his kinetic drawing method while he sketched a live model. Lopez's model for this particular lecture was Angelo Colon seen here, who served as a body double for Grace Jones and also was an artist in his own right. Acting as a muse, Colon sits patiently in a chair while Lopez is seen standing to his right in front of a large sheet of white paper. Dressed in fire engine red pants and a button-down white shirt, Lopez swiftly applies swabs of color to the scrappy canvas with oil pastel crayons like a painter. He glances back and forth at Colon as he draws. He steps back briefly to reveal a simulacra of Colon's angular face. Meanwhile, the unmistakable chant, like chorus, of Grandmaster Flash's white lines is overheard while Lopez sketches. And let me show you the video here. I'll play this quickly again, a little bit of it here. Lopez demonstrates his seemingly effortless ability to harness hip-hop's brash sonic energy and compress it into dense line and color. Coincidentally, Lopez's singular skill as a fashion illustrator was ascribed by a close friend as dancing on paper. Puerto Rico-born Lopez, whose father was a mannequin maker and whose mother was a seamstress, was a successful fashion illustrator in New York City and Paris by the late 1960s with a sui generis aesthetic vision. He treated the body as sculpture and fashion as art, while straddling downtown and uptown, the popular and the avant-garde. Known colloquially as the, quote, Picasso of fashion illustration, he is most well known for radically vivifying a seemingly dead Eurocentric artistic form and transforming it into one brimming with American pop sensibilities. Fashion illustration was in rapid decline by the 1960s as it was supplanted by photography, in part because such renderings were typically stiff and waspy, to use Lopez's adjectives, quote, very Lord and Taylor. In contrast, Lopez modernized the form by injecting fashion illustration with a, quote, feeling of sensuality, a feeling of movement, a feeling of sex, being outward, as he remarked. You can see some of his other work here. Artist Andy Warhol, who was a mentor and a friend to Lopez, lauded one of Lopez's earliest drawings, seen here, the 1967 cover of French Elle. Warhol described a cover that described it as if Lopez had made it as if, quote, by a machine, showing no traces of the human hand. And Lopez's confident and breezy drawings repeatedly showcased a facility with how bodies moved in space and how fashion acted as a potent signifier of personal style. Across 3 decades, Lopez's colorful, spirited drawings drew from visual cues from psychedelic art and youth cultures in the late 1960s, and disco and queer sensibilities in the 1970s and 1980s, while continually reflecting pop art's inspiration of the quotidian and the commercial. And his artistic subjects, particularly his portrayals of women, radiated a magnetic self-assuredness and palpable sexuality that infused these drawings with undeniable sex appeal. While briefly enrolled at FIT in the early 1960s, Lopez met Juan Ramos, a fellow FIT student in interior design, who also was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in Spanish Harlem. Briefly involved romantically, Lopez and Ramos would remain lifelong artistic collaborators. Together, they rented 2 floors in a townhouse in the West Village on 13th Street while working at the New York Times before moving in 1967 to the Carnegie Hall Studios on 57th Street, renting 1 space to live and 2 to work. And they established a lasting template for their working relationship, with Lopez often drawing at his noisy studio amidst a crowd of friends, while Juan was creating the setting for his drawings. The signature Lopez was used by the pair as a brand to signal this evolving collaborative approach, rather than imply Lopez's sole authorship of the work. Lopez and Ramos officially moved to Paris in 1969, where they stayed until 1975. Quote, "I introduced pop art to the Europeans. What I brought with me was the American models, the American designers, the American makeup artists, hairdressers. We just brought a whole group of people with us, and we had a center in Europe. They even opened up discotheques after us," he casually notes in an interview in 1983. Lopez was a central player in and documentarian of New York's downtown scene of the 1970s and 1980s. Simultaneously, he was the orbit of an eclectic artistic network with an outsized influence. Lopez and Ramos lived, collaborated, and socialized alongside an amoeba-like web of artists, models, fashion editors, photographers, and performers. Lopez and Ramos helped shape, while living in Paris, Lopez and Ramos helped shape the careers and modeling credentials of a select group of then unknown American models, most famously Donna Jordan, who is seen here, Grace Jones, Pat Cleveland, Jerry Hall, and Jessica Lange. Editorials about the group appeared in Andy Warhol's Interview and Esquire, seen here, in the early 1970s. And they were often referred to as, quote, Antonio's Girls was the name of the group. However, as a badge of identity, Antonio's Girls extends past these select models, delineating a broader and as yet unnamed system of friendships, working relationships, and gatherings that hovered around his studio. The product of these extensive artistic collaborations, seemingly haphazard in their organization and yet formal in their aesthetic principles, art making that was fun and improvisational, while also elegant and cosmopolitan, works that merged art historical references, commercial design, and Nuyorican street sensibilities are the focus of this chapter. Lopez is primarily thought of as a fashion illustrator, but he was also a pioneer in the realm of photography, describing his Kodak Instamatics series as conceptual in nature, as well as art direction and fashion design, most notably for Italian fashion boutique Fiorucci. And what follows, I tightly focus on a brief heady period of rapid innovation, roughly from 1975 to 1978, when Lopez's acumen in photography, window displays, and fashion design were seemingly in full bloom. My hope is to cast a magnifying lens on a significant and overlooked body of work and the conditions of its possibility, friendship, limited resources, and boundless creativity. So the part that I'm skipping here is I talk about the kind of interesting switch that Lopez makes from fashion illustration to photography using the Kodak Instamatic camera. So I'm going to start with another epigraph here. My mind is like a plastic bag. It's 1977 and we are going mad. It's 1977 and we've seen too many ads. It's 1977 and we're going to show them that apathy is a drag. So this is called a sugary pop art of the Candy Bar Girls. In the late 1970s, while English punk siren Polly Stry was rashly decrying the deadening effects of consumer culture in the UK, Antonio Lopez and Juan Ramos exuberantly embraced one of the most ubiquitous mass-produced items in American culture as a photographic subject, the candy bar. The Candy Bar Wrapper series, roughly 1976 to 1978, also referred to as the Candy Bar series, will be the focus of this chapter, this section here. Luckily, a surviving set of preliminary sketches and balloon paper, 4 in total that are dated from 1976, served as a set of vividly rendered blueprints that, despite their hastily drawn lines, lay bare the design and modeling elements of Lopez and Ramos's bold concept. In each quote-unquote fashion study, we see a series of topless women situated inside of what appear to be life-size cylindrical tubes with scribbled writing on the side. Each model, captured in idiosyncratic poses, is fanned by a flame-like swirl of orange scribbles, seemingly emanating around the upper half of their bodies, suggesting a fiery visual eruption. Despite their slapdash abstractness, a palpable kinetic vivacity is conveyed in these sketches. In each, with the individual model's name written in blue below the drawn figure, Lopez tinkered with how space, perspective, and proportion would work within the frame. For instance, Lopez conveyed a salient degree of depth in at least 2 of the drawings, with the respective models, Jane and Anita, appearing to lean against a wall inside a large cube-like structure. They imply that the models are dynamically arranged inside of a setting resembling a 3-dimensional environment, as opposed to posing in front of a 2-dimensional background. These sketches, in other words, indicate a more theatrical version of self-presentation that seems closer to performance art than fashion photography, with the body as art object exhibited in a space resembling the white cube of the gallery. Lopez and Ramos's lengthy prep work for the Candy Bar Wrapper series made use of professional and romantic relationships, as well as a proximity to commercial arenas where source material could be quickly acquired. First, Ramos designed a movable stage for the models to pose in. In a pencil rendering by Paul Karanikas, we see the spatial particulars of this design. He stipulated an enormous box on wheels that was 10 feet in width, depth, and height. Open in the front, the box tapered down to 8 feet in the back, as Karanikas' side view makes evident. Carpenter and artist Michael Thiel, Lopez's boyfriend and the studio manager at the time, built the stage to these specifications, as well as the cylindrical tubes that the models posed in. Lopez and Ramos then drafted the Candy logos, occasionally riffing on the model's name and using it as a starting point for the design, as well as meticulously hand-painting the tubes with acrylic. In 1978, Lopez and Ramos acquired 2,000 square feet of additional studio space when a building at the corner of Union Square West and 16th Street was converted into lofts. This new studio, though, was also down the street from Paragon Sports. There, Ramos and Lopez purchased space blankets, highly reflective insulated emergency blankets first developed by NASA in 1964, taking advantage of the shiny material's close resemblance to the layer of aluminum foil typically found underneath the candy bar wrapper. When seen in photographs, it becomes clear that the foil-like appearance of the space blankets achieves the intended visual effect of the orange swirls in the sketches, as if the voluptuous models had suddenly erupted out of the ripped open tops of the life-size candy bar wrappers. Taken together, these parts and props demonstrated Lopez and Ramos's brick-or-layer type approach to the Instamatics series they curated together, while showing that their collaborative approach to art making also extended past themselves. And yet it was the embodied larger-than-life presence of the models themselves who were the final component of this series. Like trained performers, they activated the assorted candy bar fittings and staged themselves as edible objects of desire. We can glimpse this in the surviving Instamatics, several of which have not only been reproduced in books dedicated to Lopez's oeuvre, but also reappeared digitally. Specifically, these Instamatics most often circulate on Pinterest bulletin boards created by fans, attesting to an abiding affection for the series despite its esoteric nature. The vast majority of the models are unknown. A partial list I was able to obtain of 15 models includes names that have surfaced either throughout this chapter or in other series utilized by Lopez and Ramos. And yet, despite their relative anonymity, the animated visages and bold bodily expressivity of the models, most who appear to be posing while fully nude, attest to Lopez and Ramos's distinct artistic direction. In short, these models are not stiff avatars of icy glamour. Rather, the models in the Candy Bar Rapper series share a self-possessed confidence in their fleshy physicality that is conveyed through their agile and angular bodily poses and their ecstatic and sometimes even almost post-coital faces. At times, the visual effect of Ramos's tapered ceiling at the back of the portable stage makes it seem as if the models are larger than life, not only bursting out of the candy bar wrappers, but also pushing against the walls, boxing them in. The photographic emphasis on the models themselves and ostensible encouragement to reveal rather than mask their individual personalities operated in tandem with the larger paradigm shift in the modeling world that began in the 1960s. Due to the influence of youth culture, as historian Elspeth Brown explains, modeling's previous focus in stiff couture was discarded in favor of street style, fashion boutiques, and the, quote, erotic circuit between the model and the photographer, unquote. As a result, gay fashion photographers de-emphasized the clothes and instead, quote, honed in on the women wearing the clothes, the models, as well as their movement and sexuality, unquote. When eyed through the purview of the long 1970s, the enduring effect of this seismic change pervades the theatrics of this Instamatics series a decade later. Here we perceive how the colorful pop of the candy bar wrappers is upstaged by the exquisite sensuality of a multiracial cast of models who seemingly rip themselves out of them in thrilling abandon. So the visual format of the Candy Bar Wrapper series is greatly indebted to the realistic figure paintings of California-bred artist Mel Ramos, a little-known exemplar of 1960s pop art whose controversial canvases greatly impacted his reputation. While his first paintings in the early 1960s were centered on popular comic book superheroes, another fecund source for pop artists, his most well-known works were and remain his paintings of nude white women, often posed suggestively alongside or emerging out of life-size replicas of Cuban cigars, Wrigley's gum, Coca-Cola bottles, Velveeta cheese, and Yes candy bars. These works merged visual cues from pinup culture and pop art's creative recontextualization of mass culture. Ramos's paintings, though, were interpreted by some critics as pointed critiques of the sexist underbelly inherent in commercial advertising, even if his own words partly contradicted that view. From 1963 onward, he was exhibited alongside his fellow 1960s pop art compatriots, including Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, though their careers radically outpaced his own. In 1975, Playboy Press published a book of these pinup drawings entitled The Girls of Mel Ramos, and it is possible that Juan Ramos, no relation, casually ran across this book in New York City while sourcing materials in 1960s pop art for Lopez's ongoing Instamatics series. And yet the choice of Mel Ramos's paintings as a template for Lopez and Ramos's commercial work is a curious one, because so many of the reviews of his work from the late 1960s onward were polarizing, and also because he became the target of feminist ire. And I'm going to paraphrase this next part, but really quickly, what I'm referring to in particular is Linda Nochlin. So Linda Nochlin is an art historian who famously wrote this essay called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, in which she really rejects the idea of greatness as a synonym for white male artistic genius. And one of the artists that she talks about is actually Ramos. So as a result of this, what we kind of see is that Mel Ramos, part of the reason we don't know exactly who he is because Mel Ramos is actually seen as a kind of misogynist. And it's a large part of the reason why his work has been dismissed. Ramos's impunity, so I say, all this to say that Ramos's kind of impunity may have sullied, in part, some of the interpretations of the Candy Bar series, particularly when it gained wider appeal in 1979. So in particular, when the series was used for magazine covers in France, such as this one. So model Virginia Shattuck, whom Lopez met in New York City in 1977, was featured on the cover of Photo Magazine, a monthly magazine dedicated to photography, and a special issue titled New in New York. In addition, the magazine also ran a spread of other models from the series seen here. Meanwhile, rising singer-performer Grace Jones was featured on the cover of Lou, a monthly adult magazine oriented towards men that anointed her in translation as the new symbol of disco. Despite their evident artistry and warm reception in Europe, the Candy Bar series were maligned by some feminists and journalists as demeaning and objectifying. Lopez's aforementioned relationships with the models gives little credence to these claims, but yet in the context of Mel Ramos's notorious reception in the art world, as well as burgeoning feminist reappraisals of art history, it is easily understandable why some viewers would perceive the series in this manner. But a more panoramic view of the Candy Bar Rappers series includes less formalized photographs and slides of Grace Jones, seen here from 1977, that while not fully assuaging feminist concerns, do reveal the process of getting ready and the takes that often end up on a cutting room floor. In these numerous close-cropped Instamatic photographs, Joan in costume strikes an array of poses. Sometimes she acts mischievously, playfully sticking her tongue out at the photographer, but in others we see her acting more seriously, modeling for a different camera outside the frame. In several, Antonio's name is stylishly written in red cursive on the outside of the wrapper, as we see in the top right, where two fingers point at one of the photos. Riffing on both Lopez and Jones's names, the wrapper appears to say Antonio's Almond Jones. In another Instamatic, an unidentified Asian American man in a white shirt is seen in the foreground. Standing behind Jones, while Juan Ramos is prominently seen in the foreground, glancing momentarily at the camera while holding onto the top of Jones's candy bar wrapping with both of his hands. Jones, meanwhile, looks coyly at the camera, only the top half of her face visible while her arms are arched above her head. Shot in Lopez and Ramos's studio in 878 Broadway, where all the photo shoots took place, these Instamatic photographs are decidedly low-tech and unvarnished. Some are lit by natural light, while others suggest the additional glow of an unseen spotlight. Plywood presumably appears in a few of the photographs, possibly part of one of the unfinished walls of the stage. In another photograph, we can see a tall metal ladder propped next to a long pipe, most likely used by Lopez to stand on while he photographed, which I think, yeah, it's in this one. Another photograph, Jones poses seductively in front of the ladder with an empty wine glass in her hand, seen here. Meanwhile, the brightly lit slides show full views of Jones in costume posing inside the stage in a set of multiple takes, seen here. One take is nearly identical to the cover chosen for Lee magazine. Each showcases Jones trying on different facial expressions and bodily vocabularies. These little scene slides and Instamatic photographs, when seen together and set against the more polished photographs, illuminate the collaborative labor that transforms assorted art supply and sporting good components into a coherent, sophisticated look. This circuit of quote-unquote doing on the part of the model, photographer, art director, assistant, as well as the builder of the hastily built stage itself, is more typically positioned outside the frame of fashion photography, where it remains unseen and unacknowledged. Yet Lopez's quick documentation and preservation of this action with instant photography implies its importance. Filtered back through the entire series of 15 or so women, they impart that each model's expressions and choreography are not simply the product of Ramos and Lopez's coaxing. Quite the contrary, their composition is also indebted to the deliberate efforts of these other unknown aides, who are adjusting the light, repositioning the model's costumes on the stage, or perhaps turning the volume up on a record player. While the more prominent work in the series implies that these models are seemingly ready-made, these obscure photographs and Instamatics pull back a proverbial curtain to unveil what we might call a fashion becoming, or a gradual coming into oneself as the embodiment of an artistic idea. And in this manner, what we perceive here and see in the larger series is a type of freedom, one that functions less like a right one possesses or a definitive point of arrival, and more like, to quote Josh Chambers-Letson, an intangible, quote, something to be collectively improvised, produced, and made. I highlight these behind the scenes Instamatics and slides here to point us towards larger interconnected themes in the Candy Bar Wrapper series. In particular, friendship, rehearsal, and a more expansive vision of the artistic act. This loose set of photographs allude to the multiple hands at play in the creation of these images, as well as the scripting of these models as artistic subjects. If we peer closely, we can often perceive this labor hovering at the edges of the frame, such as the glimpse of an upturned hand and a hand poking out, of an upturned arm and a hand poking out the left side of one of these slides. In particular, I'm talking about the slide all the way at the bottom, the second from the right. Friendship and love, the word that Jones used to describe the act of Lopez photographing her, are not typically emphasized in art historical scholarship. And yet many artists themselves living and working together in the 1970s underlined friendship as the bulwark that enabled their work to flourish. This is particularly true of minoritarian artists who often lack the institutional recognition from majoritarian museums that their wider and more noteworthy peers enjoyed. These artists, as a result, often designed their own collectives, often formed around asymmetrical lines of relation, as curator Thomas Lack stresses. These loosely organized groups resisted the narrative of single authorship that is often so fetishized by museums, and instead fused their, quote, shared anxieties about the social and political context into open-ended and often participatory artworks. Lopez's and Ramos's joint production of these images and an elastic collaboration with others fits squarely within such a historical reassessment. I'm going into my last paragraph here. Moreover, the haphazard scenes in Lopez and Ramos's Broadway studio captured in these on-the-fly images illustrate the stage of rehearsal. Usually typified as the mere prelude to the main event, rehearsal is often minimized in scholarly discussions as well. Yet here it becomes a star attraction. A counterintuitive focus on rehearsal itself, rather than the formal product of that action, indexes what Michelle Stevens calls a, quote, haptic notion of the artistic act. This enlarged idea of the artistic process highlights the various stages inherent to the production of an image or a performance. Viewing it, in other words, as an ongoing, quote, interaction in the making between the artist and the subject, the energy flows between the camera lens and the corporeal body of the model, rather than, quote, an action with a terminated end. Such an interpretive move then may also include what we cannot see, such as the various lubricating agents that help these women become full-throttled versions of themselves. Perhaps wine is poured into Joan's empty goblet. Maybe a joint was passed around, or someone played the new 12-inch remix of R&B singer Lolita Holloway's Hit and Run, gloriously lengthened out to an unheard of 11 minutes. These visible and unseen elements ignite into the electrifying visual frisson the candy bar wrapper series elicits. In these photographs, a group of bold models, many known to us now only by their first names, pointedly refuse the more positive images of women advocated by second-wave feminists, or the deleterious effects of advertising that Polly Strine vocally lamented in the very beginning of this talk, or this section rather. Instead, these models irreverently oozed their engorged nude bodies out of torn asunder candy bar wrappers, boldly resignifying their fleshy physicality as a cloying confection gone wildly awry. This vivid hybrid of performance art, fashion photography, and pop art animates a more horizontal notion of art making, a working together, in other words, where tasty technicolor iconicity is produced out of reciprocity, improvisation, and networks of relation. Thank you.
Thank you, Uri. Fascinating talk. Let's go to our question. So the first one is, given that Antonio Lopez was most known as an illustrator, why do you choose to focus on a set of lesser known photographs?
What I decided to do, it is a counterintuitive move. I definitely acknowledge that, but I decided that when I was in the archive reading about Lopez, one of the things that he was really concerned with is he wanted to be taken really seriously as an artist. And when I started thinking more broadly about what that meant, it kind of became clear to me that all of the Instamatic photographs are not really talked about. You know, everybody talks about him as a fashion illustrator, but there's this whole body of work from the 1970s into the early 1980s. This is not really talked about and not emphasized. So I purposely focus on a 3-year period, roughly from 1975 to 1978, because I want to talk about what he was trying to do in switching from fashion illustration to an Instamatic camera. And I also wanted to in other words, as I talk about it at the end, a kind of more horizontal notion of him as an artist. So what if instead of us kind of creating this hierarchy where fashion illustration is at the top and everything else is below it, what if we create a more horizontal idea where fashion photography, illustration, store design, and fashion design all kind of operate on the same level? And in that way, I thought there'd be we would have a more expansive way to kind of think about what Lopez was trying to do as an artist. You know, that's one way to think about it.
Yeah, that's great. The next question, your close reading of these texts are fascinating. Are you working with any interviews or oral histories with these models to see what the experience were like for them?
You know, it's hard to do oral histories of models because, again, so many of them are unknown. You know, the primary people I've been working with have actually been the people in charge of the archive. So Paul Karanikas and Devin Karanikas run the Antonio Lopez and Paul Ramos archive in Jersey City. So I've actually been using Paul in particular as a resource because he was there in person for so many of these series. Yes, I've been doing that. Part of the problem, though, when you write about somebody like Lopez, is there's just not a lot to go on. There really is very little, if any, scholarship on him in terms of the academy. There are coffee table books. So part of it has been it's been a hunt. I mean, if I'm being really honest, like you have to really hunt to try to find pieces. So part of it has been, you know, Lopez, you know, I have to go to memoirs. So like, you know, what Grace Jones says about Antonio Lopez in her memoirs, what a model like Pat Cleveland says about Antonio Lopez. Some of it has been YouTube videos. There's several interviews of him online and people talking about him. So I've really had to kind of piece together different pieces from different sources about what people say about him, and in doing so, construct this narrative around his life, and to kind of think about, yeah, the narrative around his life, the narrative around the work. And again, I say this in a talk, part of the reason I talk about friendship and love is that was the thing that was really striking to me in the archive. I wrote about a lot of artists, but it's really unusual the way that people talk about him and this love they have towards him. So I thought that was really striking to me. And I think it really also helps in terms of the way I try to interpret his work. It's kind of these loving gestures towards his friends and including them in the art making process.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So I guess following on what you just said, what do you see as the genesis of your current project? And how do you approach your work as a performance historian?
Yeah, so as a performance historian, I guess I'm taking the second part first. Yeah, part of what I do when we think about the history, I think about the history of performance. So in the first book, what I was really trying to do is debunk what I saw as a kind of received narrative in the US about where we think performance art came from. And the way that narrative is incredibly Eurocentric. So the narrative is always performance art comes from Italian futurist manifestos and data. And I used a lot of Black feminist scholars, particularly Coco Fusco, to really talk about this kind of underbelly of performance in the US that we don't talk about, which is really the kind of forced exhibition of people of color. So I kind of started the book there with P.T. Barnum's very first human exhibit, which was a Black woman, and kind of used that to kind of stage this whole narrative of what would it look like if we told a history of performance that featured Black women as central players in that history rather than as side notes that we always cast aside. So I'm doing something very similar in this book. And it's funny, I had a discussion with one of the fellows about this. I don't always know what my book is about until it's completely done. But one of the things I'm really thinking about is similarly this received narrative of pop art in the US, right? The history, when we talk about the history of pop art in the US, there are always very particular people that we use to tell that story. Andy Warhol is always very prominent. But someone like Antonio Lopez is not mentioned. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to think about, again, what if we told a different history or a different story that put people like Grace Jones, Antonio Lopez, Adrian Piper, Pat Cleveland, if we put them in the center of the story, can we tell a different story about what we think American art is? And I think that's the way I'm approaching it as a performance historian. When I say that, I'm not just thinking about live events done in front of a stage. I'm also thinking about the everyday bodily acts that people do. How do people move through the world? What is the rhythm that they create in their lives? So that's in some ways how I'm approaching Lopez is I'm thinking about him as an artist, but I'm also trying to think about him as a person. How did he operate in relationship to his friends? And how did they use those friendships to create? So that might be one way to think about that.
That's great. The next question that links your work to the contemporary work. Seeing these images today, they seem from a such different era. It would be so complicated to portray women this way today. How do you connect these images to the times we live in today in our work?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I agree. They are from a different time period. And I think it's hard because, when I talk about Mel Ramos, it's difficult because of the misogyny of his work, right? I think it's very apparent. And I think when you read the way that he talked about the work, that misogyny is really clear. So yeah, I think, one of the delicate things about this particular section I read from today is I really want to think, is there another way that we can interpret these photographs that does not immediately jettison them because we think that they are objectifying? And again, this is when I really looked at interviews and when I really saw the way that some of these figures I talked about who were posing for these photographs talk about themselves in relation to the work, I realized that we have to have a different interpretation of them. We can't interpret them based on what we think of as today. So I think, what I'm trying to say, in other words, is, I think as a scholar, I try not to judge people that I write about for what I think might be their artistic choices that they have made. And I try to really approach the artists that I write about with a degree of generosity. So because of that, I had to really think about for a while, what's a different interpretation that we can use? Like, what is the most generous interpretation we can use to think about these photographs in a really expansive way that really, again, thinks of friendship as the main analytic, which again is not the thing that we usually talk about in academic scholarship. Like, friendship is probably one of the last things that we talk about. But I really want to kind of think of that circuit between Lopez and the models, like the energy flows between them, like what was being created in that moment. So that's what I try to go back to. And I think, that's why, one of the things I asked Paul Karanikas, I asked him about the 70s. Like, what was it like living in New York in the 70s? What was the music that Antonio Lopez was listening to? Like, where were they hanging out? So like, I really try to also recreate the time period that these people operated in. So that's one way to kind of think about that.
Yeah, that's great. I guess following on Antonio's models, the next question, well, first the comment, and it says, the blend of art forms and expertise that come together in this series is really fascinating. Do you see a longer arc in the careers of Antonio's girls or other legacies of Antonio Lopez's influence lasting beyond the 70s?
Oh, for sure. So what I don't say in this talk, which is interesting, is that even though Antonio Lopez is relatively obscure, he's been in the news lately, in particular because, Fendi, the fashion label, just did a whole collection that was inspired by Lopez's illustrations. So there's been several articles that have come out and people are kind of rediscovering his work. So the thing that's interesting about Lopez, I didn't know who he was until, I saw this retrospective of his work. But what's interesting is that even though he's relatively obscure, since I've been researching and writing about him, he always seems to reappear in the contemporary moment. There have been several, I've seen things where contemporary artists or even musical stars are doing stagings that very clearly reference directly or indirectly his work. So there's a way that it might be kind of subterraneous, but there's a way that Lopez, decades later, it seems like his influence has actually kind of been resurfacing in multiple forms. Part of it's also his Instagram. So if people are on Instagram, the Antonio archive is online and they're pretty active. And I think, again, there's a way that there's a lot of contemporary kind of resurgence of interest in the work that also is popping up through social media. And I think one of the ironic things that people often talk about is thinking about the kind of irony that Instagram as a name so closely mirrors Instamatic in terms of the photograph. So there's a way that I think maybe part of the indirect legacy is, what if we thought of Instagram as another form of instant photography? And I think that's a really interesting way to kind of think of Instagram in a much more historical way, as opposed to just seeing it as a kind of contemporary manifestation.
Yeah. Excellent. So another curious question. So this listener is saying, I'm thinking about the distinction between the Instamatic images and the more commercial fashion illustration work. What strikes me is that the Instamatics are designed around commodities and consumables that get destroyed in the process of photographing them. They seem to commodify, but they also seem to resist that. Could you say more about the relationship between these ends of the practice?
Okay, so between
the instamatic images and the commercial images, and how the instamatic images ends up destroying what they're, taking the picture of, and others instead don't seem to.
That's interesting. That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought of that relationship, so that's actually really helpful. Yeah, I guess I would say that the commercial aspect is interesting in part because a lot of Lopez's work was not commercial. And I think the most commercial aspect of it, it's a part I didn't talk about from here, which is when he was hired by Fiorucci to be an art director for their New York store, which is often referred to as a daytime Studio 54. So I think, what I would say is, I think that Lopez moved very seamlessly between graphic design, fashion illustration, clothing design, and photography. And I think part of the work I'm trying to do is to kind of show that, going back to the previous question, the contemporary moment, we have all these boundaries around these practices. But what's interesting about the moment that I talk about in the book is that those artists did not see boundaries between those things at all. It was very common to kind of collaborate across different mediums. So I would say is, I think what's interesting about the instamatic photographs is their disposability to some extent, right? The disposability of the photographs themselves, but also the disposability of the things within the photographs. Those things are not in museums, they're not preserved. So what's interesting about them is to think of them as things that are, quote, relatively cheap. They're not precious. Space blankets are relatively cheap, you can still get them now. So I think that's what's really interesting to me, is to take these kind of like cheap, quote unquote, cheap commodities and to kind of repurpose them and make them into kind of lasting artistic objects. But also because they're not precious, that they're easily disposable and destroyed. So I think, in that aspect, I think, that's a really fascinating kind of way to kind of think about these.
I leave it with you to think about. So next question. Can you say more about the relationship between this work and pop art? So much of what you are showing us seems to fall somewhere between an ironic view of commodity culture and a joyful embrace of it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, for sure. There's definitely an embrace of it. I think that when we think about so it's funny, I was in New York this weekend and I saw something, there was a Warhol, and it was talking about the way that to Warhol, when he was asked about pop art, what is pop art in the 1960s, he just said that pop art is about liking things. So to me, I thought that was interesting because, again, it conveys that pop art is actually an attitude. It's not necessarily about a school. Or I think the way that art historians typically talk about it and try to really periodize it in this really formal way. So I think in that way, I'm trying to have a looser idea of what pop art is. And again, I think this way, by including Lopez, who's not often included, I really am trying to broaden it out to think about even like what it means for Puerto Rican artists and their relationship to kind of the American avant-garde. So I'm really trying to kind of broaden out that category about what can be included and who's included in the conversation. In some ways, in contradistinction to, again, the kind of very formal, closed off way that art history tends to talk about pop art. So I'm really trying to have a much more elastic understanding of what that includes. But also a playful one. Like, this section is very playful. And I think in some ways, the way that I write about objects, I try to mirror what the object is doing. And the Candy Bar series is very playful and idiosyncratic. So in some ways, the writing kind of has to mirror that. But I think, again, I think kind of recontextualizing also what counts as art. And again, what it means to use very disposable commodities as a form of art, like art with a capital A in some ways.
I think we have time for one last question. So you've suggested some of the second wave white feminists' possible objections to the series. How do you relate the series to Black Power iconography?
Oh, that's interesting. Black Power iconography. You know, one of the things I say later in a different place in the chapter is I talk about photography and affect in a way that photography is so much about a spectrum of feelings. And one of the things I think I'm trying to get to is I talk about the idea that particularly for artists of color, we expect there to be a one-to-one relationship with their work. So in other words, we expect their artistic work to directly mirror who they are and in particular, their political stances. So I think that's part of the reason why I think Lopez's work has not been recuperated, because the work is not directly about his racial identity. It's not necessarily directly about his queerness, right? Like Lopez is somebody who is really thinking about form. He's thinking about form, he's thinking about color, he's thinking about feelings. So in that way, it is not a direct reflection of who he is as a person. And I think in that way, if we think about in relation to something like Black Power iconography, I think that's again where we see a very different, they almost seem like they don't go together at all, right? Precisely because you don't directly see Lopez's racial identity in his work. So in that way, I think what we could also think of is a kind of enlarged idea about the political, you know, what we think politics looks like, and in particular, what we think it looks like in art, and in particular, what we think about what it looks like with artists of color. Who are doing very politically engaged work, but it's not, again, salient in the way that we often understand politics now. So that's something I'm also kind of thinking about as well. Like, you know, what does justice look like in this particular moment with him? You know, it's not gonna look the same as the kind of contemporaneous accounts we have of it now.
Mm-hmm. We have 2 minutes. I hope we can squeeze in one question and one answer with Uri. The question is, does Lopez's sexuality, or at least his way of relating to the models, give him a different attitude towards his models and their beauty?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Does Lopez's sexuality, or at least his way of relating to the models, give him a different attitude towards his models and their beauty?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I don't say this in the talk, but again, I found this out through my research. Just to be really clear here, you know, I thought that Lopez was a gay man. And then I realized when I was doing research that Lopez actually was briefly engaged to Jerry Hall before Jerry Hall married Mick Jagger. So in this way, what I do think is really interesting, there's a documentary about Lopez as well that's on Amazon Prime. And one of the things that's interesting about that documentary is many of these women talk about being in love with him or having a crush on him. You know, like even Jessica Lange says this in the documentary. Like she says at some point, like, you know, we all were in love with Antonio, you know? So I think there's a way that, I don't mean just in terms of romance, but I think there's a way like there was a real genuine respect between Lopez and the people that he photographed, right? So that was really striking to me. And I think, you know, so I guess in other words, you know, I'm trying to say is we often think of queerness as sexuality, but I think that queerness actually is more about a different orientation to the world. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about the relationship between Lopez and his models. It was just a different type of relationship. It was not the typical model-muse relationship. Right. It was an act of love, right? So I think that's the way I'm kind of trying to think about him throughout this entire chapter in this book. Yeah, so I think that might be one way to think about that question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Uri, for the fascinating talk and your perspectives. I also want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.